All right, this is part 2. A story is a way to say something that can't be said any other way, and it takes every word in the story to say what the meaning is. You tell a story because a statement would be inadequate, a summary would be inadequate. When anybody asks what a story is about, the only proper thing is to tell him to read the story. The meaning of fiction is not abstract meaning, but experienced meaning. And the purpose of making statements about the meaning of a story is only to help you to experience the meaning more fully. Fiction is an art that calls for the strictest attention to the real, whether the writer is writing a naturalistic story or a fantasy. Even when one writes a fantasy, reality is the proper basis for it. I would even go so far as to say that the person writing a fantasy has to be even more strictly attentive to the concrete detail than someone writing in a naturalistic or realistic vein. Because the greater the story's strain on the credulity of the reader, the more convincing the properties in it have to be. A good example of this is the short story The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. This is a story about a man who wakes up one morning to find that he has turned into a gigantic vermin, while not discarding his human nature. The rest of the story concerns his life and the feelings and eventual death as an insect with human nature. And this situation is accepted by the reader because the concrete detail of the story is absolutely convincing. The fact is that this story describes the dual nature of man in such a realistic fashion that it is almost unbearable. The truth is not distorted here, but rather a certain distortion is used to get to the truth. If we admit, as we must, that appearance is not the same thing as reality, then we must give the artist the liberty to make certain rearrangements of nature if these will lead to a greater depth of vision of the truth. The peculiar problem of the short story writer is how to make the action he describes reveal as much of the mystery of existence as possible. He only has a short space to do it, and he can't do it by statement. He has to do it by showing, not by saying, and by showing the concrete, so that his problem is really how to make the concrete work double time for him. In good fiction, certain of the details will tend to accumulate meaning from the action of the story itself, and when this happens, they become symbolic in the way they work. She's saying that this happens naturally, like you don't have to think, well, what symbol can I put in the story? You will have symbols or things that take on symbolic meaning just by writing. Like, you cannot write a story that doesn't have meaning. It's impossible. You can't do it. Your story will take on some sort of meaning naturally. So first, you have to focus on just writing it. In fiction, 2 and 2 is always more than 4. The only way I think to learn to write short stories is to write them, and then to try to discover what you have done. The time to think of technique is when you've actually got the story in front of you. The teacher can help the student by looking at his individual work and trying to help him decide if he has written a complete story, one in which the action fully illuminates the meaning. In most good stories, it is the character's personality that creates the action of the story. If you start with a real personality, a real character, then something is bound to happen. And you don't have to know what will happen before you begin. In fact, it may be better if you don't know that beforehand. You ought to be able to discover something from your stories. If you don't, probably nobody else will. So, Flannery O'Connor, we've read one of her stories. She writes incredibly insightful stuff, real stuff about being a fiction writer. You should definitely pick up this book, Mystery and Manners. And yeah, just to recap something which I don't think I talked about last video. Um, the thing that guides, your sentences in a story is the point of view, as we've talked about. It can be very tempting, very intoxicating. I know it was for me when I started writing. It can be very intoxicating to write beautiful sentences, to imagine all kinds of stuff, because when you're a writer, anything you write is possible. I mean, you could write about elephants jumping on Pluto, and that's the story. I mean, it's hard for the reader to question it as long as you make it believable. I mean, you can write about anything. But at a certain point, you're going to feel the need to write about something, not just anything. You're going to feel the need to write about something, like real humans. Everything can be surreal except the humans. The humans have to be real. The main characters have to be real. And, before you get to experimenting with all kinds of crazy stuff, you want to prove to yourself, not to me or to anybody else, but you want to prove to yourself that you can do the basics. And so these are the basics of a short story, right? A classic short story is about, it's centered on one character, and this character wants something. They have a deeply, burning, powerful, emotional question. It's a question that gets to the very essence of who they are as a character, as a personality. And they're struggling with something that is tied to that emotional question. And the action of the story will unfold in such a way that the character has to confront that central emotional question. And this is tied to like their desire, this is tied to what they want to achieve or what they fear. It's tied to that specific character in a visceral way, in a way that can't be separated from them. And in the process of dealing with this, every event and every other character in the story is going to be there to help this main character realize something about themselves or about the world they live in, or about their own character, etc., etc. So before you experiment with anything else, you want to prove to yourself that you can write, let's call it a simple short story, because it's not a simple thing to do. It just sounds simple. It's a story that's focused on one main character who has one central, important, emotional question. And notice that it's not an emotional answer. Like, you don't need to give the answer. It's, the character doesn't even necessarily have to, at the end of the story, surmise what the answer is, or, what the story means, or anything like that. You don't have to do that. You just have to show it. You don't have to say it. You just have to show us a character struggling with the very central question of their being. Like the thing that they really care about, the thing that they're very passionate about, and what it says about them, and the way that they approach this, what that says about them. So if you focus on that, if you focus on creating real characters that have that central emotional question, you will know what the story needs, because you will know what the point of view of the story is. And you'll get there. You'll know everything else that has to be done if you know that central emotional question. And you don't necessarily even have to be able to verbalize it as the writer. You might only be able to intuit what the emotional question is. And only as you work on the story will it be able to unfold in your own mind as the writer what the emotional question is. And actually, the act of writing the story will itself be the answer to the emotional question, even if you don't necessarily verbalize it at any point in the story. The story itself will be the answer. And the reader will understand this. You don't have to say it, they'll know. You always want to assume that you're writing for very smart readers. Readers that you don't have to explain the story to them, but you do have to give it to them. You need to show it to them so that they have something to work with. All right, and maybe I'll do some more lessons like this. Whether I'm reading an essay or just something else. Just because obviously this is a class about writing, so this is part of the part of what you paid for, I guess, or part of what you applied for. So, yeah, enjoy your writing and your reading and your analyzing of each other's work. And I look forward to reading some more of your stories. Like I said, I've already started. And I'll make any more announcements if they are necessary. And thank you for your hard work. You guys are really doing great. When I say you guys, that's like a colloquialism. You know, I mean everybody. All of you, you're all doing great. Sorry if anybody's offended at the gender, colloquialism. But yeah, it's just you're all doing great, and I'll see you in another video.